The echoes of courage. The sun rose over the sleepy town of Meadowview, casting its golden light over the wide streets and charming storefronts. To the untrained eye, it was a tranquil morning, with little to hint at the storm brewing beneath the surface. Sitting on her porch with a steaming mug of coffee, 91-year-old Eleanor Ellie Bradford gazed out over her garden. Her silver hair was neatly tucked into a bun, and her sharp eyes carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of stories. She was a quiet pillar of the community, her military past unknown to most. Ellie had moved to Meadowview decades ago, drawn by its peaceful charm after a life that had been anything but. During the Vietnam War, she had been one of the Army's first female intelligence officers. Her mind was her weapon, her mission to decode enemy strategies and save lives. Over the years, she had built an unassuming life, becoming the kind of neighbor everyone liked, but knew little about. Her solitude had been disrupted over the past few months by a growing shadow over the town. The Iron Fangs, a gang of ruthless bikers, had started terrorizing Meadowview. Known for their violent tactics, they demanded protection fees from local businesses and left destruction in their wake. Their leader, a towering man known as Grayson Grim Kinkade, had claimed the town as his territory, and no one dared oppose him. The police were outmatched and overwhelmed, leaving the townsfolk to fend for themselves. Ellie had heard the stories but stayed under the radar, her quiet life a shield. That changed one crisp autumn morning when the Iron Fangs roared into the parking lot of Rosie's Gas and Grocery. The rumble of motorcycles broke the stillness as Ellie parked her truck at Rosie's, a routine part of her day. The store was run by Rosie Martinez, a single mother of two, who had become a close friend over the years. As Ellie stepped out of her truck, the menacing sight of 7 Harley-Davidsons glinting under the sun greeted her. The bikers were gathered around the entrance, their laughter coarse and their presence intimidating. Ellie walked calmly toward the door, carrying her reusable shopping bag. She noticed Rosie inside, her face pale as she stood behind the counter, clutching the edge for support. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a skull tattoo crawling up his neck, was leaning over the counter, snarling demands. Ellie's steps didn't falter, her pace steady as she entered the store. "Well, what do we have here?" Skull Tattoo sneered as Ellie walked past him. "Grandma needs her prune juice." The gang erupted in laughter, but Ellie paid them no mind. She moved purposefully toward the produce section, her calm demeanor unnerving in the face of their chaos. "You deaf, old lady?" Skull Tattoo barked, slamming a hand on the counter. "We're talking to you." Ellie picked up a bundle of carrots, inspecting them as if the gang wasn't even there. She finally turned to face Skull Tattoo, her steel-gray eyes locking with his. "Son, the first rule of manners is not interrupting someone when they're shopping," she said, her voice steady and firm. The room went silent. For a moment, even the gang seemed unsure of how to respond. Then Skull Tattoo stepped forward, his face twisted in anger. "Listen here, you old." "You might want to think carefully before finishing that sentence," Ellie interrupted, her tone cutting through his bravado. She set the carrots down on the counter, her movements deliberate. "You see, I don't take kindly to bullies." The leader of the gang, Grim, pushed through the group, his presence dominating the room. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a leather jacket covered in patches that testify to his violent history. His eyes were cold as they settled on Ellie. "You've got guts, Grandma," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." Ellie didn't flinch. "I've faced worse odds." Grim's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Is that so? Well, let's see how you handle this." Before Ellie could react, Grim reached out and knocked the carrots off the counter. The thud of the produce hitting the ground echoed through the store. Rosie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ellie's calm broke for just a moment, her eyes narrowing as she stepped closer to Grim. "Pick them up." The room froze. Grim stared at her, a mix of disbelief and anger flashing across his face. "What did you just say?" "You heard me," Ellie replied, her voice carrying a weight that silenced even the snickering gang members. "Pick them up. Now." Grim laughed, but it was hollow, unsure. He bent down, pretending to comply, only to grab a piece of broken tile from the floor. He rose quickly, holding it up like a weapon. Or what? Ellie's hand moved faster than anyone expected. She grabbed the broom resting nearby and used it to knock the tile from his grip, her precision startling the gang. The clang of the tile hitting the ground made Rosie flinch. "I don't repeat myself," Ellie said, her voice icy. Grim growled, his hand twitching toward the knife on his belt. Before he could draw it, Ellie took a step back and reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. The room tensed as she calmly dialed a number. "What, you calling the cops?" Grim sneered. "No," Ellie said simply, holding the phone to her ear. "I'm calling an old friend." The bikers exchanged glances, their bravado faltering. Ellie turned her back on them, speaking into the phone. "Sam, it's Ellie Bradford. I need a favor." A pause, then a deep voice answered, loud enough for the gang to hear. "Ellie, it's been years. What's going on?" Ellie glanced over her shoulder at the gang, her expression unyielding. "I've got some unwanted guests at Rosie's Gas and Grocery. I could use some company." "Say no more," the voice replied. "We'll be there." Ellie ended the call and turned back to Grim, her calm smile unsettling. "I suggest you leave before my friends arrive. You won't like them." Grim hesitated, sensing something in Ellie's demeanor he couldn't place. "We'll see about that," he snarled. "This isn't over, Grandma." The gang filed out, their engines roaring as they sped off. Rosie let out a breath she'd been holding, her legs shaking as she gripped the counter for support. "Ellie, who did you call?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ellie bent down to pick up the scattered carrots, her movements deliberate. "Some old friends," she said, her tone cryptic, "and they're not the kind of people who take kindly to bullies." Outside, the roar of approaching motorcycles began to fill the air, but these weren't the chaotic rumblings of the Iron Fangs. These engines were steady, their cadence a symphony of discipline and purpose. Rosie peeked through the window, her eyes widening as a convoy of military-grade bikes rolled into the parking lot, each rider clad in leather vests adorned with insignias that spoke of a shared history of service and sacrifice. Ellie straightened, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. Let's see if Grim and his boys still feel brave. The battle for Meadowview had begun, and Ellie Bradford was just getting started. Shadows and strategies. The morning after the confrontation at Rosie's Gas and Grocery dawned with a tense stillness. The Iron Fang's brazen antics had disrupted the sleepy town's rhythm. But it wasn't just the gang that had everyone on edge. Word of Eleanor Bradford's mysterious friends had spread like wildfire, leaving the townsfolk curious and cautiously optimistic. For years, Meadowview had endured the suffocating grip of the Iron Fangs. Local businesses quietly paid protection fees, residents avoided the bikers at all costs, and the police, underfunded and outnumbered, did little more than file reports. But now, something was stirring. Ellie Bradford, the quietest of them all, had refused to back down, and that alone had inspired whispers of hope. In her small kitchen, Ellie stood at the sink, washing dishes while the low hum of voices drifted in from her living room. The meeting had begun. The night before, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a convoy of motorcycles had roared into Meadowview. The riders, though clad in leather vests and boots, carried themselves with a discipline that was unmistakable. These weren't your average bikers. These were men and women who had served in some of the harshest combat zones the world had ever known. Ellie greeted them with a firm handshake and a knowing look that needed no words. Each rider knew who she was, even if they hadn't met her personally. Eleanor Bradford wasn't just a retired intelligence officer. She was a legend. Her name was spoken in reverent tones among those who had served, her wartime exploits inspiring countless soldiers who'd faced impossible odds. The group had gathered in her modest living room, the largest among them. a man with a silver-streaked beard named Samuel Bear Collins, taking charge. Bear had been a sergeant in Ellie's unit during Vietnam, and despite the years that had passed, he still carried the sharp, no-nonsense demeanor of a battlefield leader. "Ellie," Bear said, settling into a chair that creaked under his weight, "what have you gotten yourself into?" Ellie gave him a faint smile as she set down a tray of coffee mugs. "The Iron Fangs have pushed too far. I'm not about to let them turn this town into a playground for their ego." Bear nodded, his expression grim. "We've been watching their movements for months. They're not just shaking down local businesses. They're a front for something much bigger. Drugs, weapons, maybe worse." "Then they're more than just a nuisance," Ellie said, her tone sharpening. "They're a threat." Bear leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What's your plan, Ellie?" Ellie glanced around the room at the riders, her old comrades. They had traded uniforms for leather, but their eyes still carried the weight of everything they'd seen and done. They were ready, just as they had been back then. "We need to hit them where it hurts," Ellie began. "The Fangs thrive on fear. Their whole operation depends on controlling the town's businesses and people through intimidation. If we can break that hold, they'll crumble." "How do we do that?" a younger rider, a woman named Lex, asked. Her Marine Corps patch was stitched neatly onto her vest. "We start by taking away their power base," Ellie replied. "That means exposing their illegal activities and cutting off their resources. But we have to do it strategically. They've got numbers and muscle, but we've got discipline and experience. We make them react to us, not the other way around." Bear's lips twitched into a grin. Classic Ellie Bradford, always thinking 10 steps ahead. "Old habits," Ellie said with a shrug. "Now let's talk logistics." By dawn, their plan was already in motion. Ellie had tasked Lex with surveillance. Equipped with a high-powered camera and a knack for blending into her surroundings, Lex spent the early hours capturing images of Iron Fangs members visiting an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The warehouse was rumored to be their headquarters, but until now, no one had dared investigate. Meanwhile, Bear and a few others were working with local business owners to install discreet cameras and panic buttons. It was slow work convincing some of the shopkeepers to allow the changes. Years of living under the Iron Fang's thumb had left many wary of rocking the boat. "What if they find out we're doing this?" Tom Simmons, the owner of the local hardware store, asked nervously as Bear drilled a small camera into the corner of his storefront. "That's the point," Bear replied, tightening the last screw. "When they do, we'll be ready." Back at Ellie's house, a temporary command center had taken shape. The dining table was now covered in maps, laptops, and radios. Ellie sat at the head of the table, her sharp mind piecing together the gang's network like a jigsaw puzzle. "We've got trucks coming in from the north," Lex reported over the radio. "Looks like a shipment. Could be drugs." Ellie frowned. "Keep your distance, but get as many pictures as you can. We need evidence." "Got it," Lex replied before the radio clicked off. Bear walked in, dusting off his hands. "Tom's store is secure. Cameras are up at Rosie's too. If the Fangs try anything, we'll know." Ellie nodded. "Good work. Now we need to figure out their next move." She pointed to the map on the table, where Lex's photos were spread out. The images showed bikers unloading crates from a semi-truck, the contents obscured but suspicious enough to raise alarm. "They're stockpiling something," Ellie said, "and they're getting bolder. If they think we're a threat, they'll escalate." Bear crossed his arms. "And we're ready for them." "Not yet," Ellie said firmly. "We need to get the town on our side first. If the Fangs think we're acting alone, they'll come after us. But if they see the whole town standing together, it's a different story." Bear raised an eyebrow. "You really think we can get these people to fight back?" Ellie's gaze didn't waver. "We don't need them to fight. We just need them to stop being afraid." That evening, Ellie called a town meeting at the community center. It was the first time in years the room had been so packed. Business owners, families, and even a few police officers crammed into the space, their faces a mixture of fear and curiosity. Ellie stood at the front of the room, her posture straight and commanding. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. The Iron Fangs have been running this town for too long, she began, her voice steady and clear. They've taken our money, our safety, and our dignity. But that stops now. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ellie let them settle before continuing. Some of you know me as a quiet old lady who keeps to herself. But I wasn't always quiet, and I'd never been one to back down from a fight. She gestured to the veterans seated at the edges of the room, their presence a silent testament to her words. These men and women are here because they know what it means to stand up against fear. They've done it before, and they'll do it again. But we can't do it alone. We need all of you. A man in the back raised his hand. What can we do? We're not soldiers. Ellie smiled faintly. You don't need to be. Stand with us. Report what you see. Refuse to pay their fees. Every small act of resistance matters. The room fell silent as her words sank in. Finally, Rosie stood up, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. I'm in. I'm tired of being scared. One by one, others followed, their courage reigniting under Ellie's steady leadership. By the end of the meeting, the people of Meadowview weren't just a town anymore. They were a community, united against a common threat. That night, as Ellie stood on her porch, watching the stars, she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. The fight ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would be risks. But for the first time in years, Meadowview had a chance to reclaim its soul. And Ellie Bradford wasn't about to let them lose it. Lines in the sand. The Iron Fangs were not used to being challenged. Grim and his gang had ruled Meadowview for years with a mixture of terror and opportunism, crushing any hint of resistance before it could bloom. But in the days following Eleanor Bradford's defiance, a new atmosphere was spreading across the town. A subtle shift from fear to quiet determination, and the Iron Fangs noticed. Grim leaned back in his chair in the dimly lit warehouse that served as the gang's headquarters. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat on the table before him. But he barely glanced at it. His focus was on the stack of photos his lieutenant, Blade, had thrown down minutes earlier. She's working with them, Blade growled, pacing the room like a caged animal. Those veterans. They're installing cameras, talking to business owners, and now the town suddenly got a backbone. Grim picked up one of the photos, squinting at the grainy image of Ellie standing on her porch. An old woman and some retired soldiers don't scare me. They should, Blade countered, slamming his fist on the table. These aren't amateurs. They've got a plan. Grim set the photo down and leaned forward, his sharp features catching the glow of a nearby lamp. Let them plan. We'll remind this town who runs it. Blade hesitated, his aggression faltering. It's not just the town anymore. Grim. Word spreading. Other gangs are starting to notice, and if they see us lose control here. Grim shot him a glare that silenced him. We're not losing control. This town is ours. Blade backed off, but the tension in the room remained. Grim knew Blade was right. The Iron Fangs couldn't afford to show weakness, not to the veterans, not to the town, and certainly not to their competitors. Grim reached for his phone. Get the crew ready. It's time we reminded Meadowview why they fear us. The veterans weren't idle. Back at Ellie's house, the command center was alive with activity. Maps covered the walls, radios crackled with updates, and a group of veterans reviewed patrol routes and contingency plans. Ellie sat at the head of the table, her sharp eyes scanning a report Lex had just handed her. They're moving more product through the warehouse, Lex said, pointing to a photo of several Iron Fangs loading crates into a truck. Could be drugs, could be weapons. Whatever it is, they're escalating. Ellie nodded, her expression thoughtful. They know they're losing control, so they're doubling down. Desperate moves mean mistakes. We need to be ready to capitalize on them. Bear leaned against the wall, arms crossed. And when they make their move, Ellie's lips twitched into a faint smile. Then we remind them who they're dealing with. The room erupted into murmurs of agreement. These weren't just veterans. They were a disciplined, unified force, bound by their shared commitment to protect the town. "What's next, Ellie?" Bear asked, his voice low but steady. Ellie tapped her finger on the map, her gaze distant. "We strengthen our defenses. We document everything. And we keep the town with us. They're our greatest asset." That afternoon, Ellie and Bear visited the community center, where volunteers were assembling care packages for families affected by the Iron Fang's intimidation tactics. The room buzzed with activity, laughter and camaraderie replacing the fear that had once defined these gatherings. "Ellie," Rosie called from across the room, waving them over. "Got a moment?" Ellie approached, nodding. "What is it?" Rosie lowered her voice, her expression serious. "One of the Fangs came by my store this morning. He wasn't threatening, but he was asking questions." Ellie's jaw tightened. "What kind of questions?" "He wanted to know who was organizing all this," Rosie said, gesturing to the busy room. "I didn't tell him anything, but he said they'd be watching." Ellie placed a reassuring hand on Rosie's shoulder. "You did the right thing. They're trying to intimidate you, but they're rattled. Stay vigilant, and don't hesitate to call if you feel unsafe." Rosie nodded, her worry easing slightly under Ellie's steady presence. Bear leaned in. "If they're watching, they'll want to make a move soon." Ellie's eyes hardened. "Let them try." That night, the Iron Fang struck. It began with the sound of shattered glass. Ellie was reviewing patrol reports at her desk when a loud crash echoed through the quiet neighborhood. She bolted to her feet, grabbing a flashlight and a small radio before heading to her front porch. A plume of smoke rose from a block away, accompanied by the faint flicker of firelight. Ellie's jaw clenched as she keyed the radio. "Bear, do you copy?" Bear's voice came through, steady but urgent. "Copy. What's happening?" "Looks like they've hit one of the stores," Ellie said, already moving down the street. "Get a team over there. I'm heading to assess the damage." "On it," Bear replied. As Ellie approached the scene, she saw the source of the fire, Tom Simmons' hardware store. Flames licked at the edges of the building, but the fire hadn't fully taken hold. A small crowd had gathered, their expressions a mix of fear and anger. Tom stood at the edge of the sidewalk, his fists clenched. "They did this," he spat. "They threw a Molotov through the window and sped off." Ellie placed a hand on his arm. "We'll handle it, Tom. Are you all right?" He nodded, though his anger remained palpable. "I'm fine. But this has to stop." "It will," Ellie promised, her voice calm but resolute. "Bear and the team are on their way. We'll get the fire under control." Within minutes, the veterans arrived, armed with extinguishers and tools to secure the building. The fire was contained quickly, leaving only superficial damage. As the crowd began to disperse, Ellie pulled Bear aside. "This wasn't just an attack," she said. "It was a message." Bear frowned. "Then we need to send one back." Ellie nodded. "And we will, but not on their terms." The following morning, the hardware store was already under repair. Veterans and townsfolk worked side by side, cleaning up the mess and reinforcing the building. The Iron Fangs had tried to intimidate the town, but instead, they had only strengthened its resolve. Ellie watched from the sidewalk, her arms crossed. Lex approached, holding a tablet with surveillance footage from the night before. "We got them on camera," Lex said, handing Ellie the device. "Clear shots of their bikes and the license plates." Ellie's eyes narrowed as she reviewed the footage. "Good. Send this to Sarah. She'll know what to do with it." Lex nodded and turned to leave, but Ellie stopped her. "And Lex, good work." A small smile crossed Lex's face. "Thanks, Ellie." As Lex walked away, Bear joined Ellie, his expression thoughtful. "They're not going to stop, you know." "I know," Ellie replied, her voice steady. "But neither are we." She turned to face the bustling repair efforts, her gaze sweeping over the determined faces of the townspeople. Meadowview wasn't just fighting back. It was reclaiming itself. The Iron Fangs had drawn their line in the sand, but Ellie Bradford and her team were ready to cross it. This was no longer just about defending a town. It was about teaching the Iron Fangs a lesson they would never forget. Real strength didn't come from fear or violence. It came from unity. And Meadowview was more united than it had ever been. The catalyst. The days following the Iron Fangs firebombing of Tom Simmons' hardware store passed like a slow-burning fuse. Meadowview was alive with activity. Repairs were made, security was tightened, and the townsfolk moved with a quiet determination that hadn't been seen in years. Ellie Bradford remained the calm center of it all, her sharp mind orchestrating every step of their response. But she knew the Iron Fangs weren't done. Grim wasn't the type to let a challenge go unanswered. It started with whispers. "Did you hear? The Fangs are planning something big. I saw 3 trucks roll through town last night. They're up to no good. They won't let this slide. Not after what Ellie did." The tension in Meadowview was palpable. Ellie sat at her dining table, now permanently transformed into the town's command center. Maps, surveillance photos, and tactical reports cluttered the surface. Across from her sat Bear, who was reviewing the latest intelligence reports from Lex. "They got reinforcements coming," Bear said, tapping a photo of the Iron Fangs warehouse. "More bikes, more muscle, and I'm hearing rumors of outside help. Mercenaries, maybe even cartel ties." Ellie's eyes narrowed as she leaned forward. "That changes the stakes." Bear nodded grimly. "They're gearing up for a showdown." Ellie exhaled slowly, her mind racing. If they're bringing in outsiders, that means Grim is feeling cornered. He needs to reassert control before his own people start questioning him. "Which means he's desperate," Bear said. "And desperate men make mistakes." Ellie tapped her fingers on the table, a habit that often accompanied her best ideas. "We need to draw them out, on our terms, not theirs. But first, we need the town to understand what's at stake. If the Fangs are escalating, the whole community has to be ready." Bear crossed his arms. "How do we do that without putting everyone in danger?" Ellie's expression hardened. "We show them what real strength looks like." The next morning, Ellie called an emergency town meeting at the Meadowview Community Center. Word spread quickly, and by noon, the hall was packed. Business owners, families, and even some of the younger residents who had never dared speak out before crowded the room, their faces a mix of fear and curiosity. Ellie stood at the front, her presence commanding as she addressed the crowd. Behind her, Bear and Lex stood as silent sentinels, their mere presence a reminder of the veterans' commitment to the town. "Thank you all for coming," Ellie began, her voice steady and clear. "I know you're afraid. And I know why. The Iron Fangs have ruled this town through fear for years. They've taken our money, threatened our families, and destroyed our property. But they've never broken us. And they won't. Not now. Not ever." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but the tension remained thick. "They've escalated their attacks," Ellie continued. "They've brought in reinforcements, but that only means one thing. They're afraid. Afraid of us. Afraid of what happens when we stand together." A man in the back raised his hand. "What can we do? We're just regular folks. We don't have your training or your resources." Ellie met his gaze, her expression softening. "You don't need military training to stand your ground. What you need is resolve. This isn't about fighting them in the streets. It's about refusing to give in. Report their movements. Refuse to pay their fees. Support each other. Every small act of defiance weakens their grip." Tom Simmons, his hands still bandaged from the firebombing, stood up. "If I can rebuild after what they did to my store, we can all stand up to them." The room erupted into murmurs of agreement, growing louder as more people voiced their support. Ellie let the noise swell, letting them find their own strength in the collective defiance. When the crowd quieted, Ellie spoke again. "They'll try to intimidate us. They'll try to scare us into submission. But remember this, we're not fighting alone. We're fighting together, and we have help." She gestured to Bear and Lex, who stepped forward. "These veterans have pledged to protect this town, just as they once protected our country. They've already installed security systems, patrolled the streets, and kept watch over your homes. And they'll keep doing it." The crowd broke into applause, the sound filling the room like a battle cry. Ellie smiled faintly. It was a start. Later that evening, as the town settled into an uneasy calm, the veterans began their next phase of operations. Ellie, Bear, and Lex sat in her living room, poring over a new set of photos Lex had taken of the Iron Fangs warehouse. "They're stockpiling something," Lex said, pointing to a photo of a large truck being unloaded. "Could be weapons, could be drugs." Ellie studied the photo intently. "If they're preparing for a large-scale operation, we need to act fast. But we can't do this alone." Bear frowned. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" Ellie nodded. "It's time to call in some reinforcements." Bear leaned back, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Who are you calling?" Ellie's smile was faint but fierce. "Old friends." The next morning, a new sound echoed through Meadowview, the steady rumble of approaching motorcycles. But these weren't the chaotic roars of the Iron Fangs. These were disciplined, precise, and commanding. The town watched as a convoy of over 30 bikes rolled into the center of town, each rider wearing a leather vest adorned with military insignias. Ellie stepped out onto her porch, her gaze steady as the riders dismounted. At the head of the group was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a clean-shaven face and piercing eyes. He removed his helmet and approached Ellie with a warm smile. "Ellie Bradford," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "Still causing trouble after all these years?" Ellie's smile widened. "John Carter. I was hoping you'd come." John Carter, known as Steele among his peers, had served with Ellie during her intelligence days. Now, he led a network of veteran motorcycle clubs dedicated to protecting small communities like Meadowview from threats like the Iron Fangs. "What's the situation?" John asked, his tone shifting to business. Ellie handed him a folder of intelligence. "The Iron Fangs are escalating. They've brought in reinforcements, and we suspect cartel involvement. We need to neutralize their operations before they can do more damage." John flipped through the folder, his expression darkening. "Looks like you've got yourself a full-blown war brewing." Ellie nodded. "And we need to end it before it spills over." John closed the folder and looked at her. "We're with you. Just tell us what you need." By nightfall, the veterans and their reinforcements had transformed Meadowview into a fortress. Patrols roamed the streets, surveillance systems monitored every corner, and plans were made for a coordinated strike on the Iron Fangs warehouse. Ellie stood at the center of it all, her mind racing as she reviewed the latest intelligence reports. She knew the next move was crucial. The Iron Fangs were like a cornered animal, desperate and dangerous. But Ellie also knew that Meadowview was ready. The town was no longer a collection of individuals cowering in fear. It was a united front, stronger than the Iron Fangs could ever anticipate. As she looked out over the bustling command center, Ellie allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. The battle for Meadowview was far from over, but they had already won something far more important, the will to fight back. And Ellie Bradford wasn't about to let them lose. The clash. The first hints of dawn crept over Meadowview, the pale light casting long shadows across the quiet streets. The town had barely slept. Patrols roamed tirelessly, while others worked under the cover of darkness to fortify businesses and reinforce vulnerable homes. The veterans and townspeople moved with a quiet urgency, knowing that time was running out. The Iron Fangs were planning something, and it wouldn't be long before they struck again. Ellie Bradford stood in her living room, staring at the large map pinned to the wall. Her hand hovered over the routes leading into and out of town, her mind working through every scenario. Beside her, John Carter, Steele, as his men called him, watched her in silence, his arms crossed. "You've always been the best at this," John said finally, his deep voice cutting through the quiet. Ellie didn't look up. "At what?" "Seeing what no one else can," he replied, finding the thread to pull that unravels everything. Ellie's lips twitched into a faint smile, though her eyes remained focused on the map. The fangs are predictable in their chaos. Grimm's trying to save face, so he'll want a public display of power. But he's also desperate, which makes him dangerous. John nodded. "And unpredictable." "Not entirely," Ellie said, tapping a spot on the map. "This is where he'll make his move." John stepped closer, studying the map. "The warehouse?" Ellie shook her head. "No, that's his stronghold. He won't risk it unless he has to. But here," she pointed to the town square, "is where he'll want to make his stand. It's symbolic, public." John's expression darkened. "And deadly." Ellie straightened, turning to face him. "That's why we won't wait for him. We'll draw him out on our terms." As the sun climbed higher, Meadowview began to stir. Ellie and her team worked quickly, coordinating patrols, securing businesses, and finalizing their plan to neutralize the Iron Fangs before they could launch their attack. Bear was in the town square, briefing a group of volunteers on the security measures they'd implemented. Cameras were discreetly placed on every corner, and several shops had been outfitted with reinforced doors and windows. "We're not looking for a fight," Bear said, his voice carrying across the group. "But if one comes, we'll be ready." Tom Simmons stepped forward, his expression resolute despite the bandages on his hands. "What about the people who aren't here? The ones still too scared to join us?" Bear placed a reassuring hand on Tom's shoulder. "They'll come around. Fear doesn't disappear overnight, but courage is contagious." Ellie arrived just as Bear finished his briefing. She gestured for him to join her, and the two stepped aside to speak privately. "Everything's in place," Bear reported. "But if Grimm brings reinforcements like we think he will, it's going to get messy." Ellie nodded. "That's why we need to hit them first, disrupt their plans before they can fully mobilize." Bear frowned. "You really think he'll fall for it?" Ellie's gaze was steady. "He doesn't see us as a real threat. That's his weakness, and we're going to exploit it." By midday, the town square was bustling with activity. On the surface, it looked like any other day in Meadowview. Shopkeepers tending to their businesses, children playing on the sidewalks, and neighbors chatting on their porches. But beneath the surface, everyone was on edge. Ellie sat in Diana's diner, a cup of coffee in front of her, as she reviewed the final pieces of their plan. Across the table, Lex monitored the live feed from their surveillance cameras. "They're on the move," Lex said, her voice low. 4 bikes heading into town from the north. Another 3 from the east. Ellie glanced at the screen. "Grimm's testing the waters. He'll send scouts first to gauge our defenses." Lex nodded. "You think he'll take the bait?" Ellie's eyes gleamed. "He won't be able to resist." Grimm sat astride his massive Harley on the outskirts of Meadowview, his cold eyes scanning the quiet streets ahead. His lieutenants flanked him, their faces hard and unreadable. Blade, ever the agitator, was the first to speak. "They're waiting for us," he said, his tone edged with frustration. "We should hit them now, while they're still scrambling." Grimm didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the town, his mind working through the possibilities. "They're not scrambling," Grimm said finally. "They're preparing. Bradford's smart. She wants us to come to her." Blade frowned. "So what do we do?" Grimm revved his engine, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "We give her what she wants." The first wave of Iron Fangs arrived just after sunset. The rumble of their bikes echoed through the town, drawing the attention of every resident. Ellie stood in the shadows of the town square, watching as the gang dismounted and began their advance. Bear and a group of veterans were positioned nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. The plan was simple: let the Fangs believe they had the upper hand. then spring the trap. Grim arrived moments later, his presence commanding as he strode into the square. He stopped in the center, his gaze sweeping over the seemingly empty streets. "Bradford," he called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Come out and face me." Ellie stepped into the light, her movements calm and deliberate. "You wanted my attention, Grim. Now you have it." Grim's smile was predatory. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long, old woman. It's time to put you in your place." Ellie's expression didn't waver. "This town doesn't belong to you, Grim. It never did." Grim's face darkened, and he took a step closer. "You think you've won. You think a bunch of washed-up soldiers and scared shopkeepers can stop me." Ellie tilted her head, her calm demeanor unsettling. "I think you've underestimated us." At her signal, lights flooded the square, illuminating the veterans who had surrounded the area. Cameras captured every angle, and the sound of approaching sirens echoed in the distance. Grim's bravado faltered as he realized the trap he had walked into. "What is this?" he growled. Ellie took a step forward, her voice cold and unwavering. "It's over, Grim. We have everything. Surveillance footage, witnesses, and now you. The police are on their way. You've lost." For a moment, it seemed like Grim might lash out, but the sight of the veterans, calm, disciplined, and ready, gave him pause. His lieutenants exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence shaken. The sound of sirens grew louder, and Grim's shoulders slumped. "This isn't over," he spat, mounting his bike. Ellie watched as the Iron Fangs retreated, their reign of terror finally coming to an end. She turned to Bear, a faint smile on her lips. "It's not over," she said quietly. "But it's a start." That night, as the town celebrated its newfound freedom, Ellie stood on her porch, gazing out at the stars. The battle for Meadowview wasn't just about defeating the Iron Fangs. It was about reclaiming the town's spirit, its courage, and its unity. And for the first time in years, Meadowview felt whole again. Redemption and reckoning. The dust of the Iron Fangs' retreat had barely settled, but the battle for Meadowview wasn't over. While Grim and his gang had been forced to flee, their network of intimidation and illegal operations still cast a long shadow over the town. For Ellie Bradford and her makeshift army of veterans and townsfolk, this wasn't the time to celebrate. It was the time to solidify their victory and ensure Meadowview would never be threatened again. The following morning, Ellie sat at her dining table, the central command hub of Meadowview's resistance. Surveillance footage, handwritten notes, and tactical maps covered every inch of the surface. Bear and Lex sat across from her, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and determination. "They've regrouped," Lex said, tapping a photo of the Iron Fangs warehouse taken earlier that morning. "There's movement at the warehouse, trucks coming and going." Grim's still in charge, but barely. "He's desperate." Bear frowned. "Desperate doesn't mean harmless. He's cornered, and cornered animals fight the hardest." Ellie nodded, "Which is why we need to finish this. We can't leave any loose ends." She stood, her gaze sweeping over the table as she laid out her plan. "We've already exposed them to the town, and the police have enough evidence to make arrests. But the warehouse is the heart of their operation. If we take that out, we cut the head off the snake." Bear raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting we go in?" Ellie's gaze didn't waver. "Not just go in. We dismantle it." Lex leaned forward, her voice cautious. "Ellie, the warehouse is heavily guarded. Grim's brought in outside help. Mercenaries, maybe even cartel connections. This isn't a simple raid." Ellie met Lex's eyes. "It doesn't have to be simple. It just has to work." The veterans spent the day preparing. In a vacant barn on the outskirts of town, they gathered their gear, discreet, efficient, and non-lethal wherever possible. The goal was to dismantle the Iron Fangs operation without unnecessary bloodshed. John Carter, the leader of the veteran reinforcements, walked up to Ellie as she examined a map of the warehouse. "You've got a hell of a team here," John said, his tone both impressed and serious. "But this isn't like Vietnam. These aren't trained soldiers we're dealing with. They're unpredictable, and that makes them dangerous." Ellie nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's why we hit them where it hurts. We control the chaos." John grinned faintly. "Just like old times." Ellie's lips curved into a slight smile. "Let's hope I haven't lost my touch." By nightfall, the operation was in motion. The veterans split into 3 teams, one to secure the perimeter, one to disrupt the warehouse's logistics, and one to confront Grim and his inner circle. Ellie, Bear, and Lex led the 3rd team. The warehouse loomed ahead, its shadow cutting across the moonlit ground. Trucks idled outside, their engines humming softly. Ellie crouched behind a stack of crates with her team, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. "Perimeter team in position." A voice crackled over her radio. "Logistics team ready," came another report. Ellie nodded, her voice calm as she gave the command. "Move in." The perimeter team struck first, disabling the gang's surveillance cameras and blocking the nearby roads to prevent reinforcements. Meanwhile, the logistics team moved swiftly to sabotage the trucks, slashing tires and removing spark plugs to ensure the vehicles couldn't be used to escape or transport goods. Inside the warehouse, Grim paced nervously. He'd felt the pressure mounting for weeks, but now it was suffocating. The veterans had outmaneuvered him at every turn, and his once loyal lieutenants were starting to question his leadership. "We need to move this shipment now," Grim barked, glaring at Blade. "If we lose this, we lose everything." Blade hesitated, his usual bravado replaced by unease. "The trucks aren't ready, and there's been talk of cops patrolling nearby. What if it's a setup?" Grim grabbed Blade by the collar, his face inches away. "If you're scared, then leave. But if you stay, you do as I say." "Got it." Blade nodded reluctantly, but before he could respond, a deafening crash echoed through the warehouse. The veterans had breached the main entrance. Ellie and her team moved with precision, their years of training guiding their every step. Smoke grenades filled the air, disorienting the gang members as the veterans advanced. Grim shouted orders, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Hold your ground. Don't let them in." But the veterans weren't interested in a direct confrontation. They methodically disabled equipment, destroyed illegal stockpiles, and isolated Grim's men from one another. The gang's disorganization worked against them, and within minutes, the warehouse was under the veterans' control. Ellie found Grim near the center of the warehouse, standing over a table littered with cash and ledgers. His face twisted with rage as he saw her. "You think you can just walk in here and take what's mine?" he snarled, pulling a knife from his belt. Ellie didn't flinch. "This was never yours, Grim. It's over." Grim lunged, but Ellie sidestepped with practiced ease. Bear stepped forward, his imposing frame blocking Grim's path. "Last chance," Bear growled. "Stand down." Grim hesitated, his eyes darting between Ellie and Bear. The sound of sirens in the distance sealed his fate. He dropped the knife, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Ellie stepped closer, her gaze cold. "You wanted a fight, Grim. But you underestimated this town. We don't bow to bullies." Grim glared at her, but said nothing as the sound of approaching police cars grew louder. By the time the authorities arrived, the warehouse was secured. The evidence the veterans had gathered was overwhelming. Drugs, weapons, and detailed records of the gang's operations. Grim and his men were arrested on the spot, their reign of terror finally over. As the police processed the scene, Ellie stood outside the warehouse, the cool night air brushing against her face. Bear joined her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You did it," he said simply. Ellie shook her head. "We did it. This town did it." The sound of cheering reached them from the edge of the property, where the townsfolk had gathered to watch. They had been afraid for so long, but tonight, they stood tall. John Carter approached, his expression serious but proud. "You took a big risk, Ellie, but it paid off." Ellie nodded, her gaze on the horizon. It wasn't just about stopping them. It was about showing this town that they're stronger than they think. The following morning, Meadowview woke to a new reality. The Iron Fangs were gone, their operation dismantled, and the town was free. Businesses reopened, children played in the streets, and neighbors greeted each other with smiles instead of wary glances. At Diana's diner, Ellie sat at her usual booth, sipping coffee as she watched the town come back to life. Rosie approached, a tray of breakfast plates in hand. "Thank you," Rosie said softly, setting a plate down in front of Ellie. "For everything." Ellie smiled. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us." Rosie nodded, her eyes glistening. "Still, we couldn't have done it without you." As Ellie looked out the window, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Meadowview had been tested, but it had emerged stronger, braver, and more united than ever. For Ellie Bradford, it wasn't just a victory, it was a legacy. And she knew that as long as the town remembered its strength, Meadowview would never fall again.